4 men in civilian clothes pulled him from his car in 9 seconds. Not a minute. 9 seconds. From the moment the first bumper hit the left fender until Adolf Tolkachev lay face down on the asphalt shoulder of Mozhaiskoye Highway, his arms twisted behind him. This level of professionalism is built through years of training. These men had trained for a long time. Tolkachev was driving to his dacha. A bag of potatoes. Friday. An open window. A typical summer evening in 1985 on a highway near Moscow. He was one of millions of Soviet citizens also heading to their small plots of land, with seeds, tools, and food for the weekend. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would distinguish him from the stream of traffic. Except for one thing. In the breast pocket of his jacket was a pen. On the outside, it was ordinary. Soviet-made. There were plenty of them in any stationery store. Inside, however, was an ampule of fast-acting poison. American-made. For an emergency. That emergency had arrived, but he couldn't use it. While his brain was still processing what was happening, his arms were already twisted behind his back, and everything was being removed from his pocket. Carefully, with 2 fingers, with an understanding of exactly what they were holding. They stripped him right there, on the roadside, down to his underwear. This wasn't humiliation for its own sake, though it served that purpose too. It was protocol. The KGB knew that serious agents of Western intelligence services always carried poison. They knew that one moment of inattention, and there would be no one left to interrogate. So, strip them immediately. Completely. Every seam. Every pocket. Right there, right now. Regardless of the passing cars slowing down and then speeding up again. Soviet drivers knew how to ignore what shouldn't be noticed. A bag over his head. Into the car. They drove off. He was taken to Lefortovo, the KGB's pre-trial detention center in eastern Moscow. A place not for criminals or hooligans, but for those the state considered its most dangerous enemies. The walls there were thick, the corridors long. The silence was unique. Not dead, but deliberate. The bag was removed once they were inside. All of this, 60 seconds on the highway, a man stripped on the asphalt, a pen with poison extracted with 2 fingers, was the culmination of a story that had begun 8 years earlier, in a quiet Moscow institute, at a drafting table with blueprints, with a pencil in hand, and thoughts that, under Soviet law, warranted the highest penalty. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev, born 1927. Lead design engineer at a classified research institute. In the Soviet system, such institutions were called NII, Naучно-исследовательский Institute, or Scientific Research Institute, and were divided into open ones for civilian development and closed ones for things not spoken aloud. Tolkachev's institute belonged to the latter type. It was the Radio Engineering Research Institute, part of the enormous Phasotron Scientific Production Association, NPO, a Soviet term for large technical complexes that combine several institutes and factories under a single administration. This particular complex worked on military aviation, developing airborne radars, the very systems located in the nose of a combat aircraft that determine whether a pilot sees an enemy before the enemy sees them. In aerial combat, this is the difference between life and death. Tolkachev designed these systems for the MiG-25 and MiG-29, the primary Soviet fighters of that era. He knew their characteristics inside and out. He knew the real figures, not those reported up the chain, but the actual ones obtained during testing. He knew where the system performed well. He knew where it lied, and it often lied. This became the turning point. The Soviet defense industry of the late 1970s operated in a unique mode, where results on paper were more important than results in reality, where success had to be reported regardless of whether success had actually occurred, where someone who knew the truth remained silent, because speaking the truth was always more dangerous than staying quiet. Tolkachev tried to speak out. He wrote to the Central Committee of the CPSU, the central governing body of the Soviet state, to which everything, including the Army and Special Services, was subordinate. He wrote to the ministry. Once, he wrote directly to the KGB about violations of secrecy protocols at the institute, hoping that this, at least, would prompt someone to react. The letters disappeared, as if they had never existed. The system did not respond. The system never responded to such letters, not because they weren't received, but because a response meant acknowledging a problem, and acknowledging a problem meant someone's accountability. And accountability in the Soviet system was something that was carefully passed on to others until it simply dissolved. After this, Tolkachev began thinking about the Americans. He thought for months. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a long internal dialogue for a man who fully understood the risks. Article 64 of the Criminal Code of the USSR, treason against the motherland. The highest penalty, execution by firing squad. Not prison, not an exchange, execution. He knew this, and still, he decided. There was also money, to be fair. This must be stated directly. 280 rubles a month was the ceiling for a Soviet engineer of his level and clearance. By the standards of an ordinary Soviet person, it was decent. By the standards of what he held in his hands every day, it was a discrepancy that over time began to irritate him. Tolkachev understood the true value of his knowledge. He made his first attempt to contact the Americans in December 1976. He simply approached a car with diplomatic plates parked near the American embassy on Sadovoye Koltso, Garden Ring. He slipped a note under the windshield wiper. Brief and to the point, who he was, what institute he worked at, what materials he had access to, how to contact him. There was no response. The CIA received the note and put it aside. An unsolicited individual appearing at an embassy with an offer of cooperation is called a walk-in in intelligence and is treated with extreme caution. It was too common a KGB tactic to plant one of their own as someone wanting to work for the West, to see how the Americans would react, who would take the bait, who would violate instructions. Professional paranoia. Absolutely justified. Tolkachev tried a second time, January 1977. Again, silence. He wrote a detailed letter with specific examples of the materials he had access to. He dropped it into the embassy's mailbox. Still nothing. 3 attempts. Several months of waiting. A less persistent person, or one less confident in what he was doing, would have given up. Tolkachev did not. He understood the Americans' logic and knew that the only way to overcome their caution was to prove his authenticity through persistence. On the 4th attempt, they responded. February 1977. A man approached his car. He spoke a word from the note. Tolkachev gave the counter word. 3 minutes of conversation standing on a Moscow street. Quietly, quickly, without unnecessary words. Then they went their separate ways. The CIA's vetting continued for several more months. They made inquiries, checked his cover story, verified that the man existed, worked where he claimed, and had access to what he stated. Everything was confirmed. In the autumn of 1977, the first operational meeting took place. John Gilsher, a CIA Moscow station officer operating under diplomatic cover, became Tolkachev's handler. Calm, methodical, able to build rapport without unnecessary words. The first meeting lasted about 2 hours. Tolkachev handed over the initial materials. That same evening, Gilsher sent an encrypted dispatch to Langley. Its meaning, translated from professional jargon to plain language, was roughly this: "We just received something we never dared to dream of." But before the first materials reached his handler's hands, they had to be photographed. Inside a classified Soviet institute, at his workplace, among colleagues, under threat of execution. The camera given to Tolkachev fit inside a key fob, an ordinary metal key fob, the kind sold in Soviet souvenir shops, nothing remarkable. A pea-sized lens and a miniature trigger mechanism were hidden within the thickened part of its casing. The press was almost imperceptible. There was no sound. The operational method was elegantly simple. Tolkachev would take out a work folder with documents, a standard action he performed dozens of times a day. He'd place it in front of him. He'd pick up his keys, as if checking for them, again, a perfectly normal gesture. He'd position the key fob over the desired page. Press. Put the keys down. Flip the folder page. Press again. 1 shot. 1 second. a maximum of 1.5. No one looked for a camera and a key fob. That was the whole calculation, not to hide the device so it couldn't be found, but to make it so no one would think to look for it. This is called camouflage through obviousness. It works better than any secret compartment. Tolkachev hid the exposed film in a specially modified pen. Soviet on the outside, American on the inside. A tiny compartment within the casing. The pen lay in his breast pocket every day. At work. In meetings. At party gatherings where vigilance and the machinations of imperialism were discussed. He sat in those meetings, listening about vigilance, with a pen containing American microfilm in his pocket. Besides the factory-made equipment, Tolkachev fabricated tools himself. An engineer with his qualifications and skill could make many things. Several mounting options for shooting in different lighting, a device for working with large format documents, a mechanism for rewinding film without additional light. When American handlers saw his homemade designs, they asked him to describe their construction in detail. For study. They said some of his solutions proved more interesting than their own factory-made ones. The man was skilled with his hands. Now, about how communication was organized, because that's a separate story. No telephones, no letters, no intermediaries. In Moscow of the late 1970s and early 1980s, with its dense network of external surveillance and agents in every courtyard, any of these channels was a potential noose. Instead, a transom window. Tolkachev had a window facing a specific direction. American operatives knew this window. Every few days, someone from the residency would drive past his building in a car, without stopping, at normal speed, like any ordinary Moscow driver. They would look at the window. If the transom was open, everything was fine, he was ready for contact. If the transom was closed, something was wrong. The meeting was off. Do not approach. This wasn't technology. It was almost primeval in its simplicity. Open or closed. 0 or 1. No interception, no decryption, no evidence. It worked flawlessly. Tolkachev received his first instructions on operational methods from a mitten. Literally from a mitten. An ordinary gray Soviet winter mitten. One of millions. It lay behind a telephone booth on a designated street. The address had been given at the first meeting. Tolkachev walked past the booth without stopping, a hand movement as if picking something up from the ground. He took the mitten and continued walking. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Instructions. How to photograph. How to transfer materials. How to behave under surveillance. How to give alarm signals. Everything clear. To the point. On a single sheet. He read it, memorized it, burned it. The mitten went into a trash can. A gray winter mitten, of no interest to anyone. The meetings for material transfer themselves took place on Moscow streets, not in safe houses, too many vulnerability points, not in cars, too easy to block, on foot, in motion. Two people walking in the same direction on a Moscow street. Handler and agent, side by side for a few minutes. During these minutes, everything happened. Film exchanged hands, money in an envelope went back, new instructions were given verbally or as microfilm. Then they parted ways. 21 such meetings over 6 years. Not a single slip-up, not a single tale detected. This was the result of two things simultaneously: the professionalism of the American handlers and Tolkachev's absolute self-possession. Over 6 years, he delivered materials that completely changed Western military analysts' understanding of Soviet aviation. Full technical specifications of the MiG-25 and MiG-29 airborne radars. Real performance indicators of missile guidance systems. Not those stated in official documents, but the actual ones obtained during testing. Data on weak points that never appeared in any reports. During that period, the MiG-25 was a genuine bogeyman for Western military planners. Soviet propaganda skillfully maintained the legend of an almost invincible interceptor. The Pentagon spent enormous sums developing countermeasures against something that, as Tolkachev's materials revealed, did not actually exist in its advertised form. CIA analysts estimated that the intelligence received saved the American military budget several $billions. Not because the Americans copied Soviet designs, but because knowing precisely what you're building against means you don't waste resources. Fighting Phantoms. Tolkachev's code name at the CIA was Sphere. The money he received for his work was astronomical by Soviet standards. Over 6 years, approximately 2 million rubles. With an average engineer's salary of 300 rubles a month, this was equivalent to over 500 years of work. The money created its own problem. Where could one put it in the Soviet Union? Savings banks were out. Any large deposit was immediately noted and raised questions. A costly car or apartment couldn't be bought with cash without explaining the source of funds. The money simply lay hidden, in caches around the apartment, in various places, divided into small sums. Tolkachev bought books, good, rare ones with cash, which didn't raise suspicion. He bought records. He asked the Americans to bring things unavailable in the USSR, Western-made medicines, jeans, once even a guitar for his son. They brought it. Upon his arrest, 600,000 rubles in cash were found in a hideout in his apartment. He had burned another 200,000 himself, 2 years before his arrest, at the very dacha where he was taking potatoes on his last day of freedom. He sensed something was wrong. He burned it just in case. It was the right decision. He just guessed wrong about what exactly was going amiss. What was going wrong was in Washington, at Joe and Moe's restaurant, at a dinner table. Aldrich Ames, an officer in the CIA's counterintelligence division, a man with access to information about agent networks in the USSR. In June 1985, he met with a Soviet intelligence officer and handed over a note. The note contained names. All the CIA agents he knew operating within the Soviet Union. Tolkachev's name, Sphere, was also on that note. For this, Ames received $50,000 in cash right at the dinner table. He later received more, several million over years of cooperation with the KGB. He bought a $500,000 house in Arlington, drove a Jaguar. His wife wore jewelry inconsistent with a government employee's salary. Colleagues noticed the discrepancy. No one raised questions. The organizational culture wasn't conducive to such inquiries. Ames worked for the KGB for 9 years before he was caught. Tolkachev was caught a few days after his name landed on the desk of Soviet counterintelligence. The KGB conducted surveillance for several months, quietly, professionally, without alarming him. They verified, prepared the operation, chose the moment. That moment arrived on June 9th, 1985, on Mojaiskoye Highway. 4 days after Tolkachev's arrest, his handler, Paul Stombaugh, arrived for another meeting with the agent, at the designated location near Kastanaevskaya Street. He was unaware of the arrest. He was going to meet Sphere. Sphere was impersonated by a disguised KGB officer. Stombaugh carried 2 shopping bags, special equipment and 100,000 rubles in cash intended for Tolkachev. The operation was carried out swiftly. He didn't have time to dispose of the contents. Detained. Searched. Everything documented. 48 hours later, Stombaugh was declared persona non grata and expelled from the USSR. He returned to Washington. He later wrote an article, in professional language, without excessive emotion, about working with agents in closed countries. The military collegium of the USSR Supreme Court heard Tolkachev's case in 1986. The verdict, execution by firing squad, carried out. In Langley his portrait hangs, a good photograph, an intelligent man in glasses, a few lines next to it. Without unnecessary words, they know how to be concise when needed. In Soviet archives lies the verdict with a single word in the operative part. The bag of potatoes remained in the back seat of the gray Volga on the shoulder of Mojaiskoye Highway. It was the last thing he ever carried home as a free man. Potatoes for the dacha,